In the quiet village of Chipping Hazel, a mystery unfolds at Hazelwood Hall when Colonel Ashby's cherished portrait vanishes from its frame, cut away with chilling precision. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle demeanor, unravels a web of secrets, whispers of a hidden ruby, a cryptic journal, and a thief driven by desperation. As suspicions fall on the manor's residents and villagers, from a nervous maid to a curious schoolteacher, Miss Marple's keen insight reveals that the true treasure lies not in gold, but in the human heart's hidden motives. Will the portrait's return restore peace, or uncover more shadows? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie-style mystery, where every glance hides a clue. Chapter 1. The Empty Frame. The October sun cast a mellow glow over Chipping Hazel, its golden rays filtering through the ivy-clad windows of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage. Inside, the drawing-room was a haven of quiet order. A vase of late chrysanthemums on the mantel, a well-worn copy of the Times folded neatly on the side table, and Miss Marple herself seated by the fire, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The soft click-clack of the needles was the only sound, save for the occasional chirp of a sparrow beyond the lace curtains. It was a scene of serene domesticity, yet Miss Marple's keen eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, betrayed a mind ever alert to the undercurrents of village life. The tranquility was shattered by the arrival of Mrs. Clara Bantry, who burst through the door with the urgency of a woman, bearing news too weighty to contain. Her sensible tweed coat was slightly askew, and her cheeks glowed with a mixture of exertion and excitement. "Jane," she exclaimed, scarcely pausing to remove her hat, "you'll never believe what's happened at Hazelwood Hall. It's the most extraordinary thing." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch, a rare interruption. She regarded her friend with a calm, expectant smile. "Do sit down, Clara, and tell me all about it. Extraordinary things, I find, are often less extraordinary once explained." Mrs. Bantry sank into the chintz-covered armchair, her hands fluttering like startled birds. "It's Colonel Ashby's portrait, you know, the one in the parlor at Hazelwood Hall. The great big thing by that artist. What's his name, Evansy? Well, it's gone. Vanished. The frame's still there, mind you, but the canvas cut clean out, like someone took a razor to it." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less observant than herself. "The portrait of Colonel Ashby," she murmured, as if testing the weight of the words. "That stern old gentleman with the whiskers, gazing down as though he disapproved of the modern world? How very curious. When was this discovered?" "This morning." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Lucy, the maid, noticed it when she went to dust the parlor. She nearly screamed, poor girl, thinking it was ghosts or some such nonsense. Eleanor Ashby's in a state, naturally. She's hosting the fete committee tonight. And now this. It's positively gothic, Jane. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles resuming their gentle dance. Her mind, however, was far from the scarf taking shape in her lap. Colonel Ashby, though long gone from this world, had left an indelible mark on Chipping Hazel. A military man of rigid discipline, he had returned from India decades ago with a modest fortune and a reputation for being both formidable and enigmatic. His portrait, painted by the local artist Herbert Pevensey, had hung in Hazelwood Hall's parlor ever since, a silent sentinel over the Ashby family's waning legacy. The manor itself, now home to the Colonel's widowed daughter-in-law, Mrs. Eleanor Ashby, and her son Lionel, was a place of faded grandeur, its walls heavy with the weight of history. "Cut out, you say?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost absent-minded, but her eyes gleamed with interest. "Not torn or ripped, but deliberately cut, precisely." Mrs. Bantry nodded vigorously. "Clean as a whistle," Lucy said. "Whoever did it knew what they were about. But why take the canvas and leave the frame? It's not as if the painting was a masterpiece. Pevensey's work is decent enough, but hardly worth stealing." Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. One might steal a thing for reasons other than its artistic merit, Clara. A portrait, after all, is more than paint and canvas. It's a symbol, a window into the past, perhaps, or a keeper of secrets. Mrs. Bantry blinked, momentarily thrown by the shift in tone. Secrets? Oh, Jane, you do have a way of making things sound so mysterious. Do you really think there's more to it? I think, Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside and folding her hands, that a theft so precise in a house as old as Hazelwood Hall is unlikely to be the work of a mere vandal. Tell me, who was in the house when this happened? Mrs. Bantry frowned, marshalling her thoughts. Well, there's Eleanor, of course, and Lionel he's always about, though he spends half his time in London, or so I hear. Then there's Lucy, the maid, and old Mrs. Gibbs, the cook, who's half-deaf but loyal as anything. Oh, and a gardener, Tom something or other, but he's not the sort to go creeping about parlors. The house was locked up tight last night, Eleanor said, and no sign of a break-in. No sign of a break-in, Miss Marple echoed, her gaze drifting to the window where a blackbird had alighted on the sill. And yet someone entered the parlor, wielded a blade with care, and removed the canvas without disturbing a thing. That suggests familiarity, don't you think? Someone who knew the house, perhaps. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You don't mean one of the family? Or the staff? Oh, Jane, that's too dreadful to contemplate. Not dreadful, merely possible, Miss Marple said mildly. People, I've found, are capable of all sorts of things when motive stirs them. And motive, Clara, is often buried in the most ordinary places. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I think we ought to pay a call on Mrs. Ashby. A missing portrait is no small matter, and I confess I'm rather curious to see that empty frame for myself. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, her earlier agitation giving way to excitement. Oh, splendid. I knew you'd take an interest, Jane. Shall we go now? Eleanor will be so relieved to have your sharp mind on the case. Miss Marple's smile was demure, but her eyes held a spark of anticipation. Let us not keep her waiting, then. After all, an empty frame has a story to tell, if one only knows how to listen. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The late afternoon sun bathed Chipping Hazel in a soft amber glow as Miss Jane Marple and Mrs. Clara Bantry made their way along the winding lane to Hazelwood Hall. The manor stood at the village's edge, its gray stone facade half hidden by ancient yews and climbing roses that clung tenaciously to its walls. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves, and the distant chime of the church clock marked the hour. Miss Marple, her black handbag tucked neatly under her arm, walked with a measured step, her eyes taking in every detail: the uneven flagstones, the freshly trimmed hedge, the faint scuff of mud on the path leading to the manor's entrance. Mrs. Bantry, striding beside her, was still brimming with the morning's excitement, her voice bubbling over with speculation. It's like something out of a novel, Jane, she said, adjusting her hat against a sudden breeze. A portrait stolen right out of its frame. I keep thinking of those dreadful stories about art thieves scaling walls in the dead of night. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Thieves, Clara, rarely scale walls when a door will do. And this thief, I suspect, needed no such theatrics. Her tone was mild, but her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, were already piecing together the puzzle of Hazelwood Hall. They were met at the door by Lucy, the young maid, whose pale face and wide eyes betrayed her lingering shock. Her apron was crumpled, and her hands twisted nervously as she curtsied. "Oh, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, thank goodness you've come," she said, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Ashby's in the parlor, ever so upset. It's that portrait, ma'am. It was there yesterday, I swear it, when I dusted the room." "Calm yourself, Lucy," Miss Marple said gently, her voice soothing but firm. "We shall see for ourselves. Take us to the parlor, if you please." The parlor of Hazelwood Hall was a room steeped in history, its high ceilings and dark oak paneling speaking of a grandeur that had not entirely faded. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the polished floor. Above the fireplace hung the empty gilt frame, its ornate carvings now framing nothing but the faded wallpaper behind it. The sight was jarring, like a face stripped of its features. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the frame, noting the precise cuts where the canvas had been removed, the edges clean as if sliced by a surgeon's scalpel. Mrs. Eleanor Ashby rose from a high-backed chair, her composure strained but intact. She was a woman of refined beauty, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her dark dress relieved only by a single strand of pearls. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," she said, her voice steady despite the faint quiver in her hands. "How kind of you to come. This business with the portrait, it's quite shaken us all. My father-in-law's likeness was a cornerstone of this house." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "A most distressing affair, Mrs. Ashby. May I ask when you last saw the portrait intact?" "Yesterday morning," Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the frame. "I passed through the parlor after breakfast, and it was as it always was. Lucy noticed it missing this morning, just before luncheon." Miss Marple approached the fireplace, her eyes tracing the frame's contours. The cuts were meticulous, leaving only a thin strip of canvas clinging to the wooden stretcher. She leaned closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame, careful not to disturb it. "A steady hand," she murmured, "and a sharp blade. Whoever did this took their time." Mrs. Bantry, hovering nearby, peered over her shoulder. "It's so peculiar, Jane. Why not take the frame as well? It's worth more than the canvas, surely." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "The frame was not the prize." She turned to Eleanor. "Was anything else disturbed? Any signs of entry windows forced, locks tampered with?" Eleanor shook her head. "Nothing. The doors were locked last night, as always. The windows are secure. It's as if the thief was already inside." Her voice faltered, and she glanced toward the door where Lucy stood, still twisting her apron. Miss Marple's gaze followed, but she said nothing, merely noting the maid's unease. She moved to a side table where a collection of family heirlooms was displayed: a silver cigarette case engraved with the colonel's initials, a tarnished regimental badge, and a cluster of miniature portraits in delicate frames. Her fingers hovered over the miniatures, her mind turning over possibilities. "This room," she said softly, "holds many memories. The colonel was fond of his possessions, was he not?" "Oh, yes," Eleanor said, a touch of warmth entering her voice. "He was proud of his collection, especially the things he brought back from India. The portrait, though, was his favorite. He used to say it captured his spirit." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting back to the empty frame. "And yet someone saw fit to take it. Tell me, Mrs. Ashby, who was in the house last night?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening on her pearls. "Only the household. Myself, Lionel, Lucy, and Mrs. Gibbs, our cook. Tom, the gardener, lives in the cottage by the gate, but he doesn't come into the house after dark." At that moment, Lionel Ashby entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. He was a man of 35, with the restless energy of one unaccustomed to idleness. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his cufflinks gleamed as he tugged at them, a nervous habit Miss Marple noted. "Mother, what's all this?" he said, his tone sharp. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, surely you don't think this is worth such a fuss? It's just an old painting, probably nicked by some village lout." Miss Marple's smile was mild, but her eyes were keen. "A lout with a remarkably precise hand, Mr. Ashby, and one who left no trace of entry. Have you any thoughts on who might have done this?" Lionel shrugged, his expression dismissive. "None. Probably some prank. The village boys are always up to mischief." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice so soft it seemed to blend with the crackle of the fire. "But pranks are rarely so deliberate." She turned to Lucy, who had retreated to the corner of the room. "Lucy, you dusted the portrait yesterday, you said. Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone lingering near the parlor? Lucy's cheeks flushed, and her hands stilled on her apron. No, ma'am. I mean, not really. I was in and out all day, cleaning. Mr. Lionel was here for a bit, and Mrs. Ashby. And, well, Miss Reed stopped by in the afternoon to talk about the fate. But she didn't go near the portrait. I'm sure of it. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Miss Reed? The school teacher? Yes, ma'am, Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. She's on the fate committee. She was only here for a few minutes. Eleanor nodded. Sylvia Reed is new to Chipping Hazel. She's been a great help with the fate. I can't imagine she'd have anything to do with this. Of course not, Miss Marple said, her tone reassuring, but her mind already turning over the name. Sylvia Reed, a newcomer, eager to involve herself in village affairs. She filed the thought away, as one might tuck a skein of wool into a knitting bag for later use. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, clapped her hands. Jane, you're already unraveling it, aren't you? I can see it in your eyes. What do you make of it? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. Only that a missing portrait is like a missing page in a book, Clara. It leaves gaps, but the story is still there, if one knows where to look. She turned to Eleanor. Might we return this evening, Mrs. Ashby? I understand you're hosting the fate committee. It would be helpful to meet everyone under the circumstances. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. Of course. You're both welcome. Perhaps you'll see something we've missed. As they left the parlor, Miss Marple paused by the door, her gaze lingering on the empty frame. It seemed to her not just a theft, but a statement, a challenge, perhaps, to uncover what lay hidden beneath the surface of Hazelwood Hall. She thought of a case from her youth, a stolen locket that had concealed a letter, and the way the smallest detail, a smudge, a glance, could unlock a mystery. People, she murmured to Mrs. Bantry as they stepped into the fading light, are so very careless with their secrets. But secrets, Clara, have a way of coming to light. Mrs. Bantry shivered, though whether from the autumn chill or Miss Marple's words, she could not say. You give me the creeps, Jane, she said, half laughing. But I wouldn't miss tonight for the world. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Nor I, Clara, nor I. Chapter 3. The gathering the evening air was crisp as Miss Jane Marple and Mrs. Clara Bantry returned to Hazelwood Hall, the manor's windows glowing like beacons against the gathering dusk. The crunch of gravel underfoot accompanied their approach, and Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the faint outline of a footprint near the rosebeds, partially obscured by fallen leaves. She said nothing, but her mind tucked the detail away, as one might save a snippet of thread for later stitching. Inside, the parlor had been transformed for the fate committee meeting. A long mahogany table held a silver tea urn, porcelain cups, and a plate of Mrs. Gibbs' renowned shortbread, though the atmosphere was far from festive. The empty frame above the fireplace loomed like an uninvited guest, its vacant stare casting a pall over the room. Miss Marple, seated near the fire at Mrs. Bantry's insistence, adjusted her shawl and observed the assembled company with the quiet attentiveness of a gardener inspecting her roses. Mrs. Eleanor Ashby presided with strained courtesy, her hands smoothing the folds of her dress as she welcomed the group. We must carry on with the fate plans, she said, her voice resolute. The village expects it, and we shan't let this incident disrupt our duties. The committee was a small but varied lot. Dr. Richard Haydock, the village physician, sat with his arms crossed, his broad face set in a frown. His fingers, usually steady from years of wielding a stethoscope, drummed an uneven rhythm on the arm of his chair. Miss Lavinia Price, the postmistress, perched primly at the table's edge, her sharp features softened by a lace collar, but her eyes darting nervously to the empty frame. Mr. Arthur Clement, the vicar, offered a gentle smile, though his hands fidgeted with a pencil, betraying a certain unease. And then there was Sylvia Reed, the young schoolteacher, whose bright auburn hair and quick smile seemed at odds with the room's tension. She sat beside Lionel Ashby, who appeared more relaxed in her company, his earlier irritability replaced by a boyish charm as they discussed bunting arrangements. Miss Marple, introduced as Mrs. Bantry's guest, declined tea and settled back, her knitting needles producing a soft, rhythmic click that blended with the crackle of the fire. She listened as the committee debated stall placements and raffle prizes, but her attention was on the undercurrents, the glances exchanged, the pauses that lingered a fraction too long. Dr. Haydock's distraction was palpable. He barely contributed, his gaze fixed on the hearth. Miss Price, usually a font of village gossip, spoke only when prompted, her fingers clutching her teacup as if it were an anchor. Sylvia, by contrast, was animated, her suggestions for a children's art contest delivered with enthusiasm, though Miss Marple noted a slight tremor in her voice when the conversation turned to Hazelwood Hall's history. "It's such a shame about the portrait," Sylvia said, her eyes flicking to the frame. "It gave this room such character. Do you think it might be recovered, Mrs. Ashby?" Eleanor's smile was tight. "I hope so, Miss Reid. The police have been informed, though they seem to think it's a prank." Lionel snorted, leaning back in his chair. "A prank with a penknife, more like. Whoever did it had a steady hand and a bold nerve." Miss Marple's needles paused. "A bold nerve indeed, Mr. Ashby," she said, her voice so mild it seemed to float on the air. "To enter a locked house and remove a canvas so precisely suggests not just nerve, but purpose. Have any of you noticed strangers about the manor recently?" The question hung in the room like a wisp of smoke. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his fingers stilling. "Strangers? No, not that I've seen. Chipping Hazel's a quiet place. We'd notice an outsider." "Quite so," Mr. Clement agreed, though his pencil rolled from his fingers and clattered to the floor. He stooped to retrieve it, his face flushed. "Though, of course, people come and go. Tradesmen, visitors for the fete planning." Miss Price's lips pursed. "I saw a man at the post office last week asking about Hazelwood Hall. Said he was a historian, researching old estates. I didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. "A historian? How interesting. Did he give a name, Miss Price?" "Something foreign-sounding," Miss Price said vaguely. "Rossi, perhaps?" "He didn't stay long." Sylvia leaned forward, her curiosity evident. "A historian might know about the Colonel's collection. Wasn't he said to have brought back all sorts of treasures from India?" Eleanor's hand tightened on her teaspoon. "My father-in-law was a collector, yes, but the portrait was hardly a treasure. It was a likeness, nothing more. Yet someone valued it enough to steal it," Miss Marple said softly, her needles resuming their dance. She glanced at the empty frame, its gilt edges catching the firelight. "Might I take a closer look, Mrs. Ashby?" Eleanor nodded, and Miss Marple rose, moving with the careful grace of one accustomed to observing without being observed. She stood before the frame, her head tilted as she examined the remnants of canvas clinging to the stretcher. The cuts were clean, almost surgical, made with a blade honed to precision. She traced a finger along the frame's edge, noting a faint scratch on the wood, barely visible in the dim light. "A careful hand," she murmured, almost to herself. "And one that worked in haste, perhaps." Mrs. Bantry, who had been watching with barely concealed excitement, leaned closer. "What do you see, Jane? Is it a clue?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Only that whoever did this was no amateur. Clara. They knew exactly what they wanted and where to find it." She turned to the group, her gaze sweeping over each face. "This room is the heart of Hazelwood Hall, is it not? A place where family and village meet. It's curious that the theft should occur here, under so many watchful eyes." The committee exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Haydock shifted in his seat, his frown deepening. "You're not suggesting one of us had anything to do with it, Miss Marple?" "Not at all," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. I merely observe that a house like this holds many stories, and not all of them are told aloud. She returned to her seat, her knitting resuming as if nothing had happened, though her mind was weaving a pattern far more intricate than the scarf in her lap. As the meeting drew to a close, the conversation turned to practicalities, schedules for the fete, the allocation of funds. But the empty frame remained a silent presence, its absence louder than any words. Miss Marple watched Sylvia linger near Lionel, her laughter bright, but her eyes guarded. She noted Miss Price's hurried departure, her handbag clutched tightly, and Dr. Haydock's abrupt exit, muttering about a patient. Mr. Clement stayed behind, offering to help clear the tea things, though his hands trembled slightly. As they left the manor, Mrs. Bantry linked arms with Miss Marple, her voice low. "Well, Jane, what do you make of them?" I swear, I felt like everyone was hiding something. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled in the moonlight. "People often are, Clara, but it's the smallest things, a glance, a hesitation, that tell the tale. And that frame, I think, has more to say than we yet know." They walked on, the manor fading into the night, but Miss Marple's mind was alight, piecing together the threads of a mystery that was only just beginning to unravel. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Past. The morning sun rose over Chipping Hazel, painting the village in hues of gold and mist. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, set out on her customary walk, her sturdy shoes tapping lightly on the cobbled path. The village was stirring, milk bottles clinked on doorsteps, and the scent of fresh bread wafted from the bakery, but Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on Hazelwood Hall and the enigma of the missing portrait. Her walk, though leisurely to the casual observer, was a deliberate journey through the web of village life, where every conversation held the potential for a clue. Her first stop was the post office, a cramped shop where Miss Lavinia Price presided behind a counter cluttered with stamps and parcels. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, and Miss Price looked up, her sharp features tightening briefly before softening into a polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her hands busy sorting letters with a vigor that seemed almost defiant. "Dreadful business at Hazelwood Hall, isn't it? I still can't believe someone would steal that old portrait." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice as gentle as the rustle of leaves. She adjusted her spectacles, her eyes scanning the counter as if it might yield secrets of its own. "It's a bold act. It takes something so personal from such a house. You must hear all sorts of talk, Miss Price, being at the heart of the village. Did you know Colonel Ashby well?" Miss Price's hands faltered, a letter slipping from her fingers. "Oh, not well, Miss Marple. He was a private man, kept to himself after his years in India. Came in for his letters now and then, but he wasn't one for chatter." She paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "Though there were stories, you know, about things he brought back, artifacts, treasures. Some said they weren't all come by honestly." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind seized on the word treasures. "Stories can be so revealing," she said, her tone encouraging. "Did these treasures include anything specific? Paintings, perhaps, or curios?" Miss Price hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting an interruption. "Nothing specific, no. Just gossip village talk. You know how it is. Some said he had a fortune hidden away, but I never saw proof of it." She busied herself with the letters again, her movements brisk. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I've a cue forming soon." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile undimmed. "Thank you, Miss Price. You've been most helpful." As she stepped back into the street, she reflected on Miss Price's unease. Gossip, she knew, was often the shadow of truth, and the postmistress's reluctance suggested she knew more than she cared to say. Her next destination was the vicarage, a modest house tucked behind the church, where Mr. Arthur Clement was tending his roses. The vicar, a slight man with a kind face and a perpetual air of distraction, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, a pleasure to see you. I trust you're well. despite this business with the portrait? Well enough. Thank you, Mr. Clement, she replied, pausing to admire a particularly fine bloom. Roses do thrive under a careful hand. I was hoping you might share a little about Colonel Ashby. He was a generous patron of the church, I believe. Mr. Clement's expression softened, though his hands fidgeted with his pruning shears. Oh, yes, very generous. He funded the restoration of the vestry some years ago. A complex man, though, devoted to his family, but there were whispers. He lowered his voice, as if the roses might overhear. A cousin, I believe, from his mother's side. There was talk of a disputed will, something about an inheritance in India. It caused a rift long before my time here. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her face remained placid. A disputed will? How fascinating. Did the Colonel ever speak of it? Not directly, Mr. Clement admitted, snipping a wilted leaf. But he was a man who carried burdens. I sensed it in his later years, when he'd sit in the church alone. He'd stare at the stained glass as if seeking absolution. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. A disputed will, treasures from India, a portrait stolen with surgical precision. The threads were beginning to form a pattern, though the design was not yet clear. You've given me much to think about, Mr. Clement, she said. The past has a way of lingering, doesn't it? As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the portrait itself. Why steal a painting of no great artistic merit? She recalled a case from her youth, in which a stolen miniature had concealed a coded message, its theft driven not by greed, but by fear of exposure. Could the Colonel's portrait hold a similar secret? A map, perhaps, or a clue to the rumored fortune? She paused by the village green, where children played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. One woman, Mrs. Turner, the butcher's wife, waved her over. Miss Marple, have you heard about the portrait? They say it's cursed. That old Colonel's ghost is stirring. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Ghosts, Mrs. Turner, are rarely as troublesome as the living. But I'll keep an ear out for any spectral clues. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. The portrait's theft, she mused, was no random act. The precision of the cuts, the absence of other thefts, the familiarity implied by an unforced entry-all, pointed to someone with knowledge of Hazelwood Hall and its history. Miss Price's mention of treasures, Mr. Clement's hint of a disputed will, these were fragments of a larger picture, one that the empty frame had only begun to reveal. She thought of Sylvia Reed, the eager young schoolteacher, and her presence in the parlor the day before the theft. She thought of Lionel Ashby, with his restless energy and quick dismissal of the crime. And she thought of Eleanor, whose composure masked a deeper unease. Each, in their way, was a piece of the puzzle, but the key, Miss Marple felt, lay in the portrait itself or what it concealed. As the afternoon waned, Mrs. Bantry arrived, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, you've been sleuthing, haven't you? I can tell by that look in your eye. What did you find?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Only whispers, Clara, but whispers can be loud if you listen closely. The Colonel's past is not as buried as some might wish, and I suspect that portrait was more than a likeness." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "You think it's hiding something? A treasure, like in those adventure stories?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her smile enigmatic. "Or perhaps it's the absence of the portrait that reveals the most." "We shall see, Clara. We shall see." As the fire crackled in the hearth, Miss Marple's mind turned back to Hazelwood Hall, where an empty frame waited to tell its story. She had seen such things before, in the quiet corners of village life secrets, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a patient hand to unravel them. Chapter 5. A Clue in the Canvas. The pale light of a chipping hazel morning filtered through the mullioned windows of Hazelwood Hall, casting intricate patterns on the parlor floor. Miss Jane Marple, accompanied by Mrs. Clara Bantry, had returned to the manor at the invitation of Mrs. Eleanor Ashby, who greeted them with a weary grace. The theft of Colonel Ashby's portrait had left a subtle strain in her features, like a crack in fine porcelain, though her manner remained composed. The empty frame above the fireplace seemed to mock the room's elegance, its gilt edges framing nothing but unanswered questions. Miss Marple, her black handbag clasped neatly in her gloved hands, requested a closer examination of the frame. "If you'll indulge me, Mrs. Ashby," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, "I'd like to take another look. Sometimes the smallest detail speaks the loudest." Eleanor nodded, though her brow furrowed slightly. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I can't imagine what more there is to see. The police have been over it, and they found nothing but the cuts." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her eyes gleamed with quiet purpose. "The police are thorough, but they sometimes miss what an old lady's curiosity can uncover." She approached the fireplace, her steps measured, and beckoned Lucy, the maid, to assist. Lucy, still pale from the shock of the theft, brought a step-stool and held it steady as Miss Marple peered at the remnants of the canvas. The frame, ornate and heavy, bore the scars of the theft, clean slices where the canvas had been cut, leaving only tattered edges clinging to the wooden stretcher. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her gaze narrowing as she noticed a faint mark on one fragment of smudge, no larger than a sixpence, that resembled ink or paint, distinct from the portrait's muted tones. "How curious," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "This mark, it's not part of Mr. Pevensy's work. Could it be a signature, perhaps?" Eleanor, standing nearby, leaned closer, her pearls clicking softly. "A signature? But the portrait was always the Colonel's, painted by Pevensy." "I don't understand." Miss Marple's fingers traced the air above the canvas, careful not to touch. "It's possible," she said, her tone thoughtful, "that the canvas was reused. An older painting, perhaps, covered by the Colonel's likeness. Such things are not uncommon, especially with local artists short on materials." Lionel Ashby, who had entered the room unnoticed, let out a dismissive laugh. "Reused? That's nonsense, Miss Marple. It's just grandfather's portrait, nothing more. Why make it so complicated?" Miss Marple turned, her expression mild but her eyes sharp. "Things, Mr. Ashby, are often more complicated than they seem. A canvas can hide many things secrets, even that someone might wish to uncover." She paused, noting the flicker of unease in Lionel's eyes, before he masked it with a shrug. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain her excitement, clapped her hands. "Jane, you're on to something, aren't you? A hidden painting. It's like one of those Gothic novels." Miss Marple's smile was indulgent. "Not quite, Clara, but the idea has merit. If the portrait conceals another work, its theft might not be about the Colonel at all, but what lay beneath." She turned to Eleanor. "Was the portrait ever removed from its frame in your memory? Perhaps for cleaning or repair?" Eleanor shook her head. "Never. It hung there since my father-in-law's time, untouched except for dusting. He was particular about it." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. She thanked Lucy, who scurried off, and stepped back from the frame, her mind turning over possibilities. A reused canvas suggested intent a deliberate choice to hide something. She thought of a case from years ago, in a neighboring village where a stolen painting had concealed a map to a smuggler's cache. Could the Colonel's portrait hold a similar secret? Determined to pursue the thread, Miss Marple proposed a visit to the village library, where old Mr. Grayson, a former schoolmaster, kept meticulous records of Chipping Hazel's history. Mrs. Bantry, eager for the adventure, accompanied her, chattering about hidden treasures as they walked through the village. The library, a small stone building tucked beside the church, smelled of aged paper and wax polish. Mr. Grayson, a stooped figure with wire-rimmed glasses, greeted them with a nod, his hands stained with ink from years of note-taking. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry," he said, his voice creaky as an old gate. "I heard about the portrait. A queer business. How can I assist? I'm curious about Colonel Ashby, Miss Marple said, settling into a chair beside a cluttered desk. His time in India, particularly. I understand he returned with a fortune artifacts, perhaps? Mr. Grayson's eyes lit up, delighted by the chance to share his knowledge. Oh, indeed. The colonel was in the East India Company, stationed in Rajasthan. Came back in '85 with a tidy some jewels, carvings, that sort of thing. Kept most of it at Hazelwood Hall, though he was cagey about it. There was talk of a map, a map to something valuable, hidden in one of his possessions. Never found, mind you, but the rumor persisted. Miss Marple's knitting, tucked in her bag, seemed to hum with the rhythm of her thoughts. A map, she said softly. Hidden, perhaps, in a painting, or beneath one. Mr. Grayson stroked his chin. Possible, I suppose. Artists in those days often reused canvases. The colonel's portrait was done by Pevensey, but who's to say what was underneath? He was a man who liked his secrets. As they left the library, Mrs. Bantry's eyes were wide with excitement. A map, Jane. Do you think that's what the thief was after? Some treasure hidden in the portrait? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. It's one possibility, Clara, but secrets have a way of drawing many eyes. The question is, whose eyes were sharpest? She thought of Sylvia Reed's visit to the parlor, Lionel's quick dismissal, Miss Price's nervous reticence. Each was a thread, but the pattern remained elusive. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her needles clicking as she pondered. The smudge on the canvas, the rumor of a map, the colonel's secretive nature, all pointed to a motive beyond simple theft. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once described how a single detail, a misplaced book, a stray word, could unravel a mystery. The portrait, she felt, was such a detail, its absence a key to a lock she had yet to find. As the afternoon faded, Mrs. Bantry burst in, her cheeks flushed. "Jane, you're miles away. Have you solved it yet?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not solved, Clara, but I'm beginning to see the shape of things. A canvas is a fragile thing, but what it hides can be far more enduring. We must look closer at the people, and at what they fear to lose." Mrs. Bantry shivered, though the room was warm. "You make it sound so ominous, Jane. What's next?" "Next," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing. "We listen. The truth, Clara, is always whispering, if we only know where to stand." Chapter 6. Shadows of Motive. The afternoon sun hung low over Chipping Hazel, its light softened by a veil of clouds that hinted at rain. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small table in the vicarage's garden, sipped tea with Mrs. Clara Bantry and Sylvia Reed, the young schoolteacher whose bright demeanor seemed at odds with the undercurrent of tension in the village. The vicarage garden, with its neatly trimmed hedges and late-blooming asters, was a tranquil setting, yet Miss Marple's mind was far from at ease. The theft of Colonel Ashby's portrait had stirred something in Chipping Hazel, and she sensed that the answers lay not in the empty frame, but in the hearts of those who knew Hazelwood Hall best. Sylvia, her auburn hair catching the light, was recounting her efforts to organize a children's stall for the upcoming fete. "The pupils are so excited," she said, her voice warm with enthusiasm. "They're painting banners, and I thought perhaps a history quiz about the village might engage them. Hazelwood Hall has such a fascinating past, don't you think, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, met Sylvia's with a gentle smile. "Fascinating indeed, Miss Reed. I understand you've taken an interest in the manor's history. Have you come across anything particularly illuminating?" Sylvia's teacup paused midway to her lips, a fleeting hesitation that Miss Marple noted. "Oh, just bits and pieces," she replied, her tone light but her fingers tightening slightly on the cup. "Old records, mostly. The colonel's time in India sounds like something out of a novel adventure. Treasures, all that." Mrs. Bantry, ever eager, leaned forward. "Treasures. Jane, Doesn't that tie in with what Mr. Grayson said about a map? Do you think Sylvia's onto something? Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind was weaving threads. It's possible, Clara. The past often leaves traces, like footprints in the dust. Miss Reed, have you explored the Manor's library? I believe the Colonel kept a journal there. Sylvia's cheeks flushed faintly, though her smile remained bright. I did, actually. Mrs. Ashby was kind enough to let me look through it for my research. It's mostly about his military days, but there's a passage that caught my eye, something about a ruby, hidden where none shall look, beneath my gaze. I thought it was just poetic, but now, with the portrait gone, Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind. A ruby, she murmured, her voice soft as a whisper of silk. How intriguing. And you found this journal in the Manor's library, you say? Yes, Sylvia said, her enthusiasm returning. It's a treasure trove of history. I'd love to show it to you, if Mrs. Ashby permits. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, at Miss Marple's gentle urging, Eleanor Ashby agreed to let them examine the Colonel's journal. The library at Hazelwood Hall was a dim, book-lined room, its shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes and the faint must of age. Eleanor produced the journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, and handed it to Miss Marple with a sigh. I hope this helps, Miss Marple. I can't imagine what it has to do with the portrait, but you seem to have a knack for these things. Miss Marple, with Sylvia's assistance, opened the journal, her fingers careful as she turned the fragile pages. The Colonel's handwriting was precise, almost military in its discipline, but the entries were sparse, detailing campaigns and logistics. Then, on a page dated 1887, she found the passage Sylvia had mentioned. The ruby lies where none shall look, beneath my gaze. Let it rest, for greed brings only ruin. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A curious choice of words, she said, her voice low. Beneath my gaze? Could it refer to the portrait, do you think? Sylvia's eyes widened. That's what I wondered. If the portrait hid a map or a clue to the ruby, it might explain why someone took it. Eleanor frowned, her hands smoothing her dress. A ruby? Surely that's just a story. My father-in-law never mentioned such a thing. Stories, Miss Marple said gently, have a way of growing from seeds of truth. She closed the journal, her mind turning over the phrase. Beneath my gaze, the Colonel's stern eyes in the portrait, watching over the parlor. Was it a metaphor or something more literal? Dr. Richard Haydock arrived unexpectedly, his broad frame filling the doorway. He had been summoned by Eleanor to discuss the Fates medical tent, but his presence in the library seemed to unsettle Sylvia, whose fingers trembled as she set the journal down. What's this about a ruby? He asked, his tone gruff. Old tales like that are best left alone. The Colonel was a practical man, not some treasure hunter. Miss Marple observed the doctor closely, noting the tension in his jaw. Practical men, Dr. Haydock, often have impractical secrets. You knew the Colonel well, I believe? Haydock's eyes flickered, and he busied himself adjusting his cuff. Well enough. I tended him in his final years. He spoke of India sometimes, but nothing about rubies or maps. This is all fanciful nonsense. Miss Marple's smile was disarming. Perhaps. But fanciful nonsense can stir the heart, can it not? She turned to Eleanor. Thank you for letting us see the journal. It's given me much to think about. As they left the library, Mrs. Bantry whispered, Jane, you're like a bloodhound. That ruby? Do you think it's real? And do you think Sylvia knows more than she's letting on? Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. Sylvia is curious, Clara, and curiosity can lead to discovery or to trouble. As for the ruby, it may be real, or it may be a symbol of something else. The Colonel's words suggest a secret, and secrets draw moths to a flame. That evening, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving steadily. The journal's phrase echoed in her mind, conjuring images of a canvas concealing more than paint. She thought of a case from her youth, where a stolen letter had been hidden in a book's binding, its theft driven by a desperate need to protect a reputation. The portrait, she suspected, was a similar veil, its removal an attempt to uncover or conceal the truth. Sylvia's trembling hands, Haydock's abrupt dismissal, Eleanor's quiet unease each was a thread in a tapestry not yet complete. Miss Marple recalled her nephew, Raymond's words about human nature, how fear and greed could twist even the most ordinary soul. The ruby, real or not, was a lure, and someone in Chipping Hazel had taken the bait. As the firelight danced, Miss Marple's needles paused. People, she said softly to the empty room, are so predictable in their desires. But it's the shadows of those desires that tell the story. She resolved to return to Hazelwood Hall, to watch and listen, for the truth, she knew, was waiting in the quiet spaces between words. Chapter 7. The truth revealed the evening at Hazelwood Hall was heavy with the scent of beeswax and wood smoke, the parlor aglow with lamplight that cast long shadows across the oak-paneled walls. Miss Jane Marple had requested the Fate Committee's presence, ostensibly to finalize plans for the village event, but her true purpose was clear to those who knew her best. Mrs. Clara Bantry, seated beside her, fidgeted with her gloves, her eyes darting with anticipation. The empty frame above the fireplace stood as a silent witness, its gilt edges gleaming like an accusation in the soft light. Miss Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, surveyed the gathered company with the calm attentiveness of a shepherd counting her flock. Mrs. Eleanor Ashby sat at the head of the table, her composure a fragile veneer over her evident straying. Lionel Ashby lounged with affected nonchalance, his fingers toying with a silver cigarette case. Dr. Richard Haydock, his broad face set in a scowl, avoided the frame's gaze, while Miss Lavinia Price clutched her handbag as if it were a shield. Mr. Arthur Clement, the vicar, offered a nervous smile, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Sylvia Reed, her auburn hair catching the lamplight, seemed brighter than the occasion warranted, though her eyes held a flicker of unease. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of authority. "The fate, of course, is important, but I confess my thoughts are with the missing portrait. Its theft is no ordinary crime, and I believe the answer lies here among us." A murmur rippled through the room, cut short by Lionel's sharp laugh. "Really, Miss Marple, you make it sound like a detective novel. It's just a painting, probably pinched by some local with a grudge." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her smile remained serene. "A painting, Mr. Ashby, but one with a purpose. I believe it was stolen not for its artistic value, but for what it concealed, a map, perhaps, to a ruby the Colonel brought from India, as hinted in his journal." Gasps punctuated the air. Eleanor's hand flew to her pearls, and Miss Price's handbag slipped to the floor with a soft thud. Sylvia's smile faltered, her fingers tightening on her teacup. Dr. Haydock's scowl deepened, but he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the hearth. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady as her knitting needles. "The journal spoke of a ruby hidden where none shall look, beneath my gaze," a curious phrase, suggesting the portrait itself was the key. The canvas, I suspect, covered an older work, perhaps a map or a clue to this treasure. The thief knew this, and their actions were precise, deliberate, and informed by knowledge of Hazelwood Hall. She turned her gaze to Sylvia, whose flush deepened under scrutiny. "Miss Reed, you've shown a keen interest in the manor's history. You found the Colonel's journal and noted its cryptic passage. You were also seen near the parlor the day before the theft by Lucy, who thought little of it at the time." Sylvia's cup clattered into its saucer. I was only researching for the fate," she stammered, her voice rising. "I didn't take the portrait. I wouldn't." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her eyes were unrelenting. "I believe you, Miss Reed, but not entirely. You suspected the portrait hid something valuable, didn't you? The ruby, perhaps, or its map. You took the canvas to an art restorer in town, hoping to uncover what lay beneath. The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Sylvia's shoulders slumped, her bright facade crumbling. "I didn't mean any harm," she whispered, tears welling. "The school is falling apart. No funds for repairs. I thought if the ruby was real, it could help. I took the canvas to Mr. Harrow in town just to see if there was a map. He hasn't even started yet." Eleanor's face paled. "You took it? Sylvia, how could you?" Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture calming. Miss Reed acted out of desperation, not malice. But there is another piece to this puzzle. Her gaze shifted to Dr. Haydock, whose fingers had stilled on his chair. "Doctor, you knew of the ruby, didn't you? The colonel confided in you during his final illness, perhaps in a moment of remorse. You suspected Sylvia's intentions, but said nothing, hoping to avoid a scandal that might tarnish his memory." Haydock's jaw tightened, but he met her eyes. "He mentioned a ruby, yes," he admitted gruffly. "Said it was hidden, but he never told me where. I thought it was delirium. When the portrait went missing, I wondered, but I had no proof." Miss Marple nodded, her expression softening. "Proof is often elusive, but motives are not. Miss Reed sought to help her school, and you, Doctor, sought to protect a friend's legacy. The portrait's theft was a collision of good intentions and old secrets." She turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Ashby, I suggest you retrieve the canvas from Mr. Harrow. If it holds a map, it belongs to your family. If not, its return will restore some peace to this house." Eleanor, though shaken, nodded. "I'll see to it tomorrow. If there's a ruby, it's part of my father-in-law's estate. I want no more secrets." Lionel, who had been silent, stood abruptly. "This is absurd. A ruby, a map, it's all fairy tales. The portrait's just an old picture." Miss Marple's smile was patient. "Fairy tales, Mr. Ashby, often hide truths. But sometimes the truth is simpler than we imagine." She rose, her shawl slipping slightly. "Thank you all for your candor. The fate, I trust, will proceed smoothly now." As the committee dispersed, Miss Price retrieved her handbag with trembling hands, and Mr. Clement murmured a prayer under his breath. Sylvia lingered, her eyes downcast, and Miss Marple offered her a gentle pat on the arm. "Honesty, Miss Reed, is a fine remedy for a troubled heart." Outside, under the starry sky, Mrs. Bantry linked arms with Miss Marple, her voice brimming with awe. "Jane, you're a marvel. You unraveled it all, like pulling a thread from a tangled skein. Is the ruby real, do you think?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled in the moonlight. "Real or not, Clara, it was real enough to stir action. People, I find, will do much for what they believe to be true." As they walked back to the village, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the empty frame. The ruby, if it existed, was secondary to the human frailties it had exposed: greed, fear, hope. She recalled a case from her youth, where a stolen brooch had revealed a family's hidden shame. Here, the portrait had done the same, its absence a mirror to the desires of those around it. Chapter 8. The Parlor Restored. The soft glow of a late October afternoon bathed Chipping Hazel in a golden haze, as if the village itself were exhaling a sigh of relief. Hazelwood Hall stood serene at the edge of the green, its ivy-clad walls catching the last rays of sunlight. Inside, the parlor had regained a semblance of its former dignity. The portrait of Colonel Ashby, retrieved from Mr. Harrow, the art restorer in town, once again hung above the fireplace, its stern gaze restored to its rightful place. The canvas, carefully reattached to its frame, bore no trace of its brief absence, save for the faintest creases where it had been cut. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage drawing-room, worked at her knitting, the familiar click-clack of her needles a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Clara Bantry, her face alight with the satisfaction of a mystery resolved, had arrived for tea, her hat slightly askew from her brisk walk across the village. The air was fragrant with the scent of scones and a pot of Darjeeling, but the conversation, as ever, turned to the events at Hazelwood Hall. "It's almost too neat, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, spreading jam on a scone with enthusiasm. "The portrait back in its frame, Sylvia forgiven, and no Ruby after all. I confess, I was hoping for a treasure chest, like something out of a pirate tale." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled over her spectacles, though her expression remained serene. "The heart, Clara, is often more swayed by the promise of treasure than its reality. Mr. Harrow's examination was most revealing, was it not? The restorer, a meticulous man with a penchant for detail, had confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. The canvas bore no hidden map, only an older, unremarkable landscape painting beneath the colonel's likeness, a pastoral scene of little value, likely reused by Pevensey to save on materials. The ruby, if it existed, remained a phantom, its legend rooted more in village gossip than in fact. Eleanor Ashby, with characteristic grace, had accepted the portrait's return without fuss, though she insisted on a thorough search of the manor's attic for any trace of her father-in-law's rumored fortune. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. "But Sylvia, Jane taking the canvas like that, I never would have thought her capable. She's such a bright young thing." Miss Marple's needles paused as she set her knitting in her lap. "Youth and brightness, Clara, are no shield against desperation." Miss Reed saw a chance to save her school, and the colonel's journals stirred her imagination. It's a common enough failing seeing what one wishes to see. She sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the window, where a blackbird hopped along the sill. "I recall a young woman in my village, years ago, who took a silver spoon from her employer, thinking it would pay for her brother's medicine. Good intentions, Clara, can lead to curious paths." Sylvia, chastened by her actions, had confessed fully to Eleanor, offering to resign from the fate committee. Eleanor, however, had demurred, insisting that Sylvia remain and channel her energy into fundraising for the school's repairs. "A second chance," Miss Marple had remarked to Mrs. Bantry, "is often the best remedy for a youthful misstep." Sylvia had accepted, her gratitude tempered by a newfound humility, and the village had rallied around her, eager to move past the scandal. Dr. Haydock, too, had emerged from the affair with his reputation intact, though his reticence about the colonel's confessions had raised eyebrows. "He meant to protect the family," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "A doctor's loyalty can be as binding as a vow, but silence, I find, often speaks louder than words." Mrs. Bantry set down her scone, her expression thoughtful. "And Lionel? He was so quick to dismiss the whole thing. Do you think he knew more than he let on?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Lionel Ashby is a young man impatient with the past, Clara. He saw the portrait as a relic, not a secret. But his restlessness, his quickness to scoff, suggests a discomfort with Hazelwood Hall's shadows. I suspect he was relieved when no ruby was found." The Fate Committee had resumed its work with renewed vigor, the portrait's return a signal to close the chapter on the theft. Miss Lavinia Price, though still prone to nervous glances, had regained her usual volubility, regaling the village with tales of the great portrait mystery. Mr. Clement, the vicar, had preached a sermon on forgiveness, his words carrying a pointed warmth toward Sylvia. And Eleanor, ever the gracious matriarch, had hosted a small gathering to mark the portrait's restoration, her poise a testament to her resilience. As the tea cooled, Mrs. Bantry leaned back, her eyes gleaming. "You saw it all, Jane, from the start. That smudge on the canvas, the journal's clue, you pieced it together like one of your scarves. How do you do it?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the scarf in her lap growing steadily. "It's only a matter of looking, Clara," she said, her voice as gentle as the fading light. "People are so very predictable, you know. A portrait may hang for decades, but it's the secrets it stirs, the hopes, the fears that tell the tale. I've seen it before in 100 little villages where human nature is the same." Mrs. Bantry laughed, shaking her head. "You're a marvel, Jane. I swear you see more from this armchair than most do in a lifetime of running about." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she said nothing, her thoughts drifting to the parlor at Hazelwood Hall. The portrait, restored, gazed down once more, its stern eyes guarding no treasure but the quiet truths of those who lived beneath it. She thought of a case from her youth, where a missing locket had revealed a family's hidden grief, and how the smallest act of theft, a confession, could illuminate the heart. The ruby, real or imagined, had done the same, drawing out the desires of a village and laying them bare. As Mrs. Bantry chattered on, Miss Marple's needles clicked, weaving not just wool, but the satisfaction of a mystery resolved. The parlor was restored, the frame no longer empty, but the true restoration, she knew, was in the clarity it had brought to Chipping Hazel, a clarity that, like her knitting, came from patience, observation, and a quiet faith in the patterns of human nature.